Susan MacDonald's hands trembled so violently that the stick of sealing wax dragged red across the margin of the marriage contract before the clerk had even blotted the final line. The smear looked like a wound. She tried to lift her wrist to steady herself, but Lady MacDonald's gloved fingers closed around it with a pressure that bit through kid leather and skin alike. "Do not disgrace us now," her stepmother murmured, a smile fixed for the vicar and witnesses. "Sign." Susan signed. At 22, she had been called plain so many times that she had learned to wear the word like an apron. Practical, unlovely, useful. Plain girls were not expected to be cherished. Plain girls were expected to be grateful. Yet mirrors had always betrayed that judgment with irritating inconsistency. They gave back the clean line of her dark brows, the solemn steadiness of large grey eyes, and a pale, thoughtful face more suited to account books than ballrooms. She had her father's expression when reckoning sums, alert, unsparing, almost severe. It made men uncomfortable if they noticed. Most did not. When Mr. MacDonald was alive, he had noticed. He had sat her beside him at his desk in Edinburgh and tapped columns of figures with his penknife while she copied totals in a firm, compact hand. "Numbers do not flatter and do not forgive," he used to say. "Learn them, and you will never be entirely at anyone's mercy." He had taught her leases, freight charges, grain contracts, and how to hear deceit in a solicitor's courteous delay. Then he died in the winter influenza, leaving a daughter legally provided for and practically exposed. The settlements were clear in ink and vulnerable in life. Lady MacDonald had debts, taste, and a talent for quiet coercion. In 3 years she managed what open theft could not. She isolated Susan from old friends, called in obligations, delayed disbursements, and made every route to independence narrower until it became one thin lane with a single signpost: marriage, not courtship, payment. The widowed Earl of Rothmere required a wife of acceptable name and modest dowry to quiet certain pressing accounts and produce, in time, another heir. Susan required an escape from her stepmother's tightening hand before the remnants of her father's estate were swallowed in fees and invented liabilities. So they were married in a church that smelled of cold stone and extinguished candles, with no music and fewer congratulations. The Earl, tall, dark, and composed to the point of cruelty, placed the ring on her finger, as if completing a formal transfer. He did not look at her longer than courtesy demanded. On the journey south, she sat opposite him in the carriage and watched frost feather the window corners. He read dispatches. She folded and unfolded her gloves. Once, near York, the coach lurched at a rut, and her shoulder struck the padded side. His hand moved as if to steady her, then withdrew before contact, resting instead on his knee like a man who had reached toward a fire and remembered old burns. By evening they turned through the gates of Rothmere Abbey, where high walls held in the damp and old generations. The house rose in honeyed stone and long windows darkening toward dusk. Rooks tilted over the chimneys in ragged black loops. Susan stepped down from the carriage with stiff legs and a private vow. Endure, not demand, not hope. Endure. If she could keep her dignity, keep accounts honest, and keep peace where she could, that would be enough. Inside, the entrance hall swallowed sound beneath its vaulted ceiling. Portraits climbed the staircase in gilt frames. Men in armour, women in pearls. Children posed beside spaniels and harpsichords. A footman took her cloak, as if receiving state papers. Another announced her with practised volume, and the words echoed too large around her. "The Countess of Rothmere!" No one cheered. Why should they? The household staff lined the corridor in precise formation, faces disciplined into respectful blankness. Their new mistress was a stranger installed where another woman had ruled and died. Grief lingered in houses like scent in fabric. It did not leave because a priest had spoken. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves, offered a formal curtsy and keys on a silver ring. "Your ladyship's apartments are prepared." Prepared for whom? Susan wondered, and did not ask. That first hour passed in a blur of unfamiliar rooms and practical details, where linen was kept, which bells summoned which maid, which dairy accounts awaited signature. She listened because listening was safer than speaking, and because information was always a kind of armour. Dinner was brief and silent. The Earl asked if she required anything. She answered no. It was the truth, and also a lie so old she no longer felt it pass her lips. Afterward she might have retired. Instead, restless from travel and strain, she asked to be shown to the blue drawing-room for tea, thinking a quiet fire and a cup might still the pounding at her temples. A maid led her down a corridor lit by sconces, past a pair of closed doors and a narrow table set with winter camellias. The maid withdrew. Susan entered alone. The tray rattled before she registered the woman holding it. Mrs. Pike, she would later learn, the late Countess's personal maid. At that instant she was only an older woman with cap askew and eyes widening until the pupils swallowed the brown. Porcelain clinked sharply against silver. One cup tipped and rolled, leaving a crescent of tea on the tray cloth. Then Mrs. Pike sank, not a servant's ordinary dip, but a deep, deliberate curtsy that seemed to take all the air from the room. "My Lady Eleanor," she whispered, voice raw, as if dragged over gravel. "You have come home." Silence crashed down. 2 footmen by the door dropped their eyes to the carpet as if the pattern required scholarly attention. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had followed with a basket of correspondence, became suddenly occupied with arranging envelopes that needed no arranging. Near the hearth, where she had not seen him on entering, the Earl stood rigid, one hand braced on the mantel, knuckles blanched against dark wood. Susan felt the blood climb her throat. "I am—" No one moved to help her finish. Rothmere crossed the room in 3 clipped strides. His face had altered without changing, still composed, yet shuttered from within by something older and harsher than embarrassment. "That will be all," he said to the servants. Mrs. Pike did not rise at once. He did not repeat himself, but the words sharpened. "All of you." They went, skirts brushed, boots thudded softly. The door closed with careful finality. Susan and the Earl stood in the wake of the mistaken name as if it had substance, as if it could be walked around and avoided if one chose each step with enough care. He did not explain. "I am sorry for the distress," he said at last, formal as winter. "Mrs. Pike has served this house through difficult years. She will remember herself." Susan wanted to ask who Lady Eleanor had been in life, and in death, and in his face when another woman spoke her name to a stranger. She wanted to ask whether she truly resembled the dead Countess, or whether grief had made ghosts of all women in this house. Instead she said, "Of course, my lord." He bowed a fraction too stiffly. "You are fatigued. Good night." By dawn, rumour had done what servants and silence always did best. Multiplied. In the servants' hall, in the stable yard, in the village lane where butcher and baker traded news with loaves and chops, a story took shape with convenient speed. The new Countess had walked into the blue drawing-room, and the old maid had recognised her as the dead Lady Eleanor returned. No correction had come quickly enough to matter. Half the household whispered that the new lady wore the former Countess's face. The other half decided she wore her place with deliberate imitation. Susan heard none of this directly at breakfast. She heard it in pauses, in glances that began at her brow and ended at her hands. In the way, two maids ceased speaking when she entered and resumed only after she passed. By luncheon, the village dressmaker sent regrets for a fitting already agreed. By tea, a note arrived from Lady Winters postponing Susan's call until circumstances settled. Circumstances, Susan thought, were another word for a woman no one trusted yet. Lady MacDonald arrived 6 days later, all black satin affection and strategic concern. She embraced Susan in the entrance hall, kissing only air near her cheek. "My poor child," she said loudly enough for the nearest footman to hear, "I could not rest until I saw how bravely you bore these unkind comparisons." By supper she had visited the breakfast room, inspected the silver, expressed sympathy to the chaplain, and dropped, like crumbs for pigeons, carefully phrased hints that fluttered into appetite. "Susan has always had a gift for adopting the manners of those she admires," she told one neighbouring baronet's wife, over cards. "Quite unconsciously, of course, though when one has observed a household from afar for years—" a sigh, a tap of lace fan. "Well, people will talk." They did. At first the talk stung. Then it calcified into something heavier, exclusion. Women declined her invitations with excuses that would have insulted a child. Men at dinners watched her too closely, as if waiting for a slip that would prove either imposture or ambition. She found herself measured against a dead woman whose portrait now hung in the morning room, Lady Eleanor in pearl grey, smiling slightly, one hand resting on a child's shoulder. The likeness, once pointed out, could not be unseen. The brows, the grave set of the mouth. Not identical. Near enough for gossip. Rothmere neither encouraged nor ended the speculation. He treated Susan with correct civility in private and public, no more, no less. He did not accuse, he did not defend. It was a neutrality that felt like standing outside in rain while someone indoors debated whether to open a door. Then the forged letters arrived. They came in a packet tied with blue ribbon and delivered by astonishing coincidence during a breakfast where 3 county ladies and Lady MacDonald were taking chocolate. The housekeeper placed them beside Susan's plate. Lady MacDonald's brows lifted. "How intriguing!" Susan untied the ribbon. Her own name stared up from the top sheet in a hand meant to resemble hers, close enough at a glance to deceive anyone who had never seen her calculate rent arrears by candlelight. She read, "If her health continues as reported, the place will soon be open. One must be patient and mirror what he misses." Another, "He responds when I lower my voice, as she did." A third, uglier for being clumsy, "By Michaelmas, I may be Lady Rothmere, if all proceeds." The room held its breath for her reaction. Lady MacDonald made a soft sound of distressed surprise, so polished it deserved applause. "Surely some enemy seeks to wound you, Susan. Though the phrasing, dear me, I did warn you that imitation can be misread." Susan laid the papers down very carefully. "These are not mine." "No." Lady MacDonald tilted her head. "Then you will not object to handing over your marriage settlement and your claim to your father's little estate until these matters are clarified. For everyone's peace, child. For the Earl's reputation. A temporary arrangement only." There it was, finally without lace. Surrender your rights and call it harmony. In the days that followed, pressure came in polite forms. A solicitor wrote requesting signatures to prevent unfortunate contention. A cousin of Lady MacDonald called to explain that prudence required sacrifices. Even Mrs. Hargreaves, apologetic but firm, asked whether certain instructions regarding Scottish rents should continue from Susan or await further certainty. Further certainty about her own life. The Earl saw the letters. She watched him read them in his study, jaw tightening once, then stilling. "I do not know who authored these," he said, "but you think it possible." He met her eyes. "I think grief makes liars of memory, Lady Rothmere, and I have trusted wrongly before." He did not demand she sign away anything. He did not say, before witness or friend, that he believed her. In another man, hesitation might have been malice. In him it looked like fear armoured as a restraint. It left her none the less undefended. The cost of that silence became plain a fortnight later on the south lawn. The Earl's son, James, a thin, watchful boy of 7, had been trotting a pony under the groom's eye when the animal shied at a flapping tarp. Pony and child went down in a tangle. Susan heard the cry from the terrace and was running before rank or protocol could ask permission. By the time the groom reached him, she was already in the mud, skirts soaked at the knees, one gloved hand bracing the boy's shoulder, while the other pressed a folded handkerchief hard against the cut at his temple. "Look at me, James," she said, voice low and level. "Can you count backward from 10? He stared, stunned and shivering. 10, 9. Good. Keep speaking. Do not sleep." Blood slicked her fingers warm. She adjusted pressure, checked pupils, called for clean cloth and the surgeon with crisp authority that surprised even her. When the Earl arrived at a run, coat unbuttoned, she did not rise. "He is concussed but responsive," she said. "Do not move his neck until Mr. Ellison comes." Rothmere dropped to one knee opposite her, eyes fixed on his son. For one suspended second, husband and wife knelt in mud like equals at an altar no one desired. James whimpered. Susan eased him closer without jarring him, murmuring nonsense comfort learned from no nursery, only instinct. Over the boy's bent shoulder she saw Lady Macdonald standing on the terrace steps, parasol tilted, mouth curved in a small, satisfied smile, as if disaster had confirmed a private argument. When the surgeon finally carried James inside and orders scattered the servants into motion, Susan rose slowly. Mud dragged at her hem. One furious tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist and turned. Lady Macdonald approached, voice sweet. "How very dramatic, Susan. One might almost think you had practised." Susan held her gaze. Not hot, not loud, still as a blade laid flat before it is lifted. "If I had," she said, "I should have practised on someone who mattered less to you." The smile faltered. Around them, listening servants looked abruptly busy. Somewhere inside the house, a door slammed. A child cried once, then was soothed. Susan stood in the wet grass with blood drying on her hands and understood with perfect clarity what was at risk now. Not merely her reputation, not merely money, not even the brittle legality of titles and settlements. A boy's safety. 2 estates being bled by patient fraud. Her father's name. Perhaps, if she dared to imagine it, the possibility that this cold, wounded house might yet become something other than a bargain struck under threat. Endurance would no longer be enough. Endurance would no longer be enough. Susan went straight from the lawn to the schoolroom washstand, where a basin of cold water sat clouded with chalk dust and ink. She plunged both hands into it. Pink plumes unravelled from her skin, then thinned, then vanished. The blood had dried in the seams of her gloves. She peeled them off finger by finger, dropped them onto a chair, and scrubbed until her knuckles burned. When she lifted her head, Mrs. Pike was in the doorway with a stack of folded cloths for James. For a heartbeat they simply looked at one another. The older woman's lined face gave nothing away, but her gaze flicked once to Susan's raw hands, then to the muddy hem, then back again. "Mr. Ellison says the young lord must be kept quiet and watched through the night," Mrs. Pike said. "He may wake confused." "I know." Mrs. Pike's mouth tightened as if she had expected less. "Yes, my lady. The right title, carefully placed. Susan dried her hands and took half the cloths without asking. Then we will watch him. James woke just after dusk, disoriented and frightened, trying to sit too quickly and gasping when pain struck. Susan was at his side before the nurse could reach him. She settled him with one hand at his shoulder and one at his wrist, speaking in the same even tone she had used on the lawn. "You are in your own bed. You fell. You are safe." He blinked at her, eyes too bright in his pale face. "Is Papa angry?" "No." A pause. "Are you?" She hesitated only a moment. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but not angry." His fingers closed on the edge of her sleeve and stayed there until sleep took him again. Near midnight the Earl came in, moving quietly enough that the floor scarcely sounded under his boots. Candlelight carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. He looked first at his son, then at Susan still seated by the bed, then at the blood-stiffened cuff she had not changed. "Ellison says he will recover," Rothmere said, voice low. "Yes." He stood a few feet away, as if uncertain of his right to come nearer the chair where she kept watch. "You acted swiftly." The words might have been gratitude if one ignored how carefully they were rationed. "He is a child," Susan replied. "Speed mattered more than permission." Something shifted behind his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or reluctant respect, then shuttered again. "You should rest." "So should you." He almost smiled. Almost. "I have had 7 years of practice in not doing so." It was the first true thing he had offered her that was not an instruction. Before she could answer, he touched James's hair once, briefly, and left. Susan remained until dawn. By morning, James's headache had eased, and the household had absorbed a new version of events. The Countess had knelt in mud like a stable boy and kept the air from bleeding out while everyone else shouted. It did not erase the old rumours. It sat beside them, inconvenient and hard to fold into the same malicious shape. Lady Macdonald disliked inconvenient shapes. She sent a note requesting a private interview in the yellow morning room, written in a slanted hand Susan had once practised imitating as a girl when she still mistook elegance for virtue. Susan went because refusal would become theatre, and theatre was what her stepmother did best. Lady Macdonald did not rise when she entered. She sat by the fire, black silk arranged like a widow's argument, and held out one of the forged letters between 2 fingers. "You see how quickly scandals root," she said. "After yesterday's display, sympathy may briefly tilt your way. That is precisely why you must settle matters now while people are inclined to mercy. By surrendering my father's estate. By placing it in neutral legal trust. Temporarily." Her smile sharpened. "Unless, of course, you prefer these letters discussed at larger tables." Susan stepped closer, took the page and studied it line by line. The imitation was less skillful than she had first believed. The forger had copied the angle of her script, but not the pressure changes, where she paused to think, the long curled wrong. The spacing betrayed a hand accustomed to ornamental loops, not columns of numbers. "Who wrote these?" she asked. Lady Macdonald gave a soft laugh. "Do not be childish. You had access to my hand from household books in Edinburgh. You had motive. You had timing." Susan looked up. "You also made one mistake." "Only one?" "I never dot my I's with circles." For the first time a tiny crack appeared in Lady Macdonald's composure, gone almost instantly, but there. "Your stubbornness was always your least attractive feature," she said. "Sign, Susan, before your husband decides prudence requires distance." "My husband has already chosen distance," Susan said quietly. "What he has not chosen is perjury." She laid the forged letter on the table and walked out before her knees could betray how hard they shook. By luncheon, Mr. Penrith, Lady Macdonald's favoured solicitor, arrived at the Abbey with a leather portfolio and a face arranged into legal sorrow. He bowed over Susan's hand in the small library, while 2 footmen pretended not to listen at the door. "Your ladyship, I bring documents intended to spare all parties distress." "I am discovering," Susan said. "That phrase usually means the opposite." Penrith coughed. "Merely precautionary transfers. Your late father's northern acreage is, as you know, burdened by complexities. My father's acreage is burdened by bills your office drafted after his death." His smile thinned. "You are misinformed." "Then inform me. Produce originals, not abstracts." "I am answerable to my clients." "So am I," she said, "and I have just become one." His eyes flicked just once toward the door as if measuring escape. "I cannot proceed without the Earl's cooperation." "Then you may request it from him in writing. Until then, leave your papers unopened." Penrith gathered the portfolio with brittle fingers and withdrew. Through the window, Susan watched him cross the gravel and confer with Lady Macdonald near her carriage. The solicitor leaned close. Her stepmother did not look surprised. That evening, Susan asked Rothmere plainly whether Penrith had long acted for his estate. "He acted for my mother," Rothmere said, "then for Elena in certain external matters. Why?" "Because he is attempting to dismember mine." Rothmere's expression sharpened, then cooled into wariness. "Do you accuse him of fraud?" "I accuse him of interest." The Earl poured brandy he did not drink. "Penrith has handled legal affairs in this county for 20 years. If you mean to challenge him, bring proof." There it was again. Not dismissal, not belief. Proof or silence. Susan held his gaze. "Very well." He inclined his head once, as if accepting terms in a contract neither of them had wanted, and both understood. The next days became a campaign fought with courtesies. Invitations failed to arrive. 2 ladies who had promised calls sent their daughters instead. At church, Mrs. Havisham shifted 1 pew forward when Susan approached, then spent the sermon in conspicuous prayer. A pamphlet appeared in the village, anonymous, crude, and deliciously specific, suggesting that ambitious widows and plain daughters alike had long studied the habits of wealthy invalids. Susan burned it without showing Rothmere. Inside the Abbey, resistance took subtler forms. A ledger she requested from the steward's office could not be found. A maid assigned to her dressing room was replaced by one who answered every question with, "I am not sure, my lady," and disappeared whenever ink or sealing wax was needed. Mrs. Hargreaves remained impeccably respectful, but began every practical sentence with, "In Lady Eleanor's time." In Lady Eleanor's time, the breakfast china had been changed in March. In Lady Eleanor's time, nursery accounts were reviewed on Thursdays. In Lady Eleanor's time, mister. Penrith's correspondence went unopened to the Earl's private desk. Susan listened, learned, and made notes no one saw. Only in the nursery did air come easier. James, confined to bed and bored into misery, tolerated stories from no one else after the 2nd day. Susan found she could manage him by treating him as clever instead of fragile. She brought maps and had him trace the route of grain shipments from tenant farms to market towns. She set him small arithmetic challenges disguised as games and watched suspicion give way to engagement, then to a wary kind of trust. On the 4th afternoon, while rain ticked against the window, he studied her with unsettling seriousness and said, "Nanny says you look like Mamma." Susan set down the slate. "Do you think I do?" He considered. "A little, not when you smile. Mamma smiled more." The honesty landed cleanly, without cruelty. "Then you must help me improve," Susan said. He nodded, satisfied by the practical response, and returned to his sums. Mrs. Pike, mending by the hearth, did not look up, but Susan saw her hand pause on the thread. Complications arrived in a single morning like letters in different envelopes bearing the same hand. First, Mr. Penrith wrote to inform her that unless she signed the transfer documents, within 10 days, claims against her father's estate would be publicly contested in Edinburgh courts. Costs, naturally, would be severe. Second, Lady MacDonald sent a separate note, all maternal pity, urging compliance before gossip harms the boy by association. Third, a sealed memorandum from the Abbey steward reported irregular payments, small at first glance, recurrent on a quarterly schedule, to an external legal account under Penrith's administration. The entries had been coded or as archival consultations. Susan read that one twice. When she asked the steward for supporting vouchers, he blanched. "Those files were in the old West Corridor archive, my lady. Damp took many papers years ago." "Damp does not sign receipts," she said. He swallowed and promised to search again. At luncheon, Lady MacDonald announced she would remain another week, out of concern for dear James, then added, without looking at Susan, "One hates to leave a child amid instability." Rothmere's knife halted briefly over his plate. "My son is not unstable." "Of course not. Children simply absorb tensions. Adults pretend are invisible." Susan set down her fork. "If your concern is genuine, perhaps you will return to town and remove one source of tension." Lady MacDonald turned to her with wounded grandeur. "How ungenerous!" Rothmere said nothing. His silence this time was less inert. It felt like a man standing between two loaded pistols and refusing to move first. After luncheon, Susan found Mrs. Hargreaves in the passage outside the still-room, giving orders for preserving pears. She asked, as evenly as she could, for access to all unused storage rooms in the West Corridor, including any chambers left closed since Lady Eleanor's death. The housekeeper stiffened. "Those rooms are not in current use." "That is why I asked for them." "Some contain private effects." "Then we will inventory them properly." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated long enough to be insolent, then dipped her head. "As you wish, my lady." Keys arrived at dusk on a tray, heavy and cold. Susan took them as if accepting a gauntlet. That night James woke disoriented and sick, as the surgeon had warned might happen. He retched into a basin, then cried in fury at his own weakness. Susan held the basin, wiped his face, and sent the maid running for fresh linen. The maid did not return. After 10 minutes, Susan went herself. The corridor beyond the nursery was dark, lit only by a taper she carried cupped in her hand. The Abbey at night breathed differently, timbers settling, distant draughts murmuring through old stone, the hush of rooms that remembered more than they revealed. She took the back stair toward the linen press in the west wing, because it was nearer, because the child in her care could not wait, because urgency leaves little room for superstition. At the top landing she found the press empty, except for mothballs and one torn blanket. From farther down the corridor came the soft scrape of paper. Susan followed the sound past shuttered windows and portraits gone grey in candlelight. One door stood ajar, the late Countess's sitting room, closed since Susan's arrival. Light moved inside, low and unsteady. She pushed the door wider. Mrs. Pike sat on the carpet before an open trunk, sorting bundles of correspondence tied in fading ribbon. For a moment, neither spoke. The maid's face, startled in the candle glow, looked older than age alone could make it. "I might ask," Susan said, "what you are doing in a room that is not in current use." Mrs. Pike gave a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. "Keeping damp and rats from eating what little truth is left, my lady." "Truth about what?" Mrs. Pike set down the bundle in her lap. Her hands trembled. Not with fear, Susan realised, but with the effort of deciding something long postponed. "When I curtsied to you in the blue drawing-room," she said slowly, "I was not mistook, not exactly." The room seemed to narrow around the words. "You called me Lady Eleanor. I called you what she called you." Mrs. Pike reached into the trunk and drew out a small oval miniature in a worn velvet case. She held it out. Inside, painted with delicate economy, was Susan at perhaps 17. Hair unpowdered, expression grave, one shoulder turned awkwardly as if she had never learned to pose. She remembered sitting for it in Edinburgh because her father wanted a likeness before she went to stay with relations in Perth for a season that never happened. "How did this come here?" Susan whispered. "Her ladyship had it from her mother's people in Scotland. She kept it in her private desk." Mrs. Pike met Susan's eyes. "Lady Eleanor was your cousin, miss. Second cousin through your father's aunt. Distant enough for society, close enough for blood." Susan sat down hard on the edge of a chaise she had not meant to approach. "I never knew." "Your stepmother saw to that, I think." Mrs. Pike spoke with a bitterness that surprised by its force. "Lady Eleanor wrote of you often these last 2 years. Said if ever misfortune came, and she feared it did, only quiet, clear-eyed Susan MacDonald would look at papers instead of faces." The exact phrase struck like a bell. Quiet, clear-eyed Susan MacDonald. Not pretty, not charming, useful in a way no one in drawing-rooms praised. "What misfortune?" Susan asked. Mrs. Pike turned back to the trunk, lifted out a devotional volume with a cracked leather spine, and placed it in Susan's hands. "She believed someone outside the family was altering estate records. Not enough to shout, only enough to bleed. Rents rerouted, fees multiplied, small thefts, regular as rain. She asked questions. Mr. Penrith always had answers." Susan opened the book. The centre pages had been hollowed to conceal folded documents wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped them and felt, before she could read, the shock of recognition in the paper itself. The cut, the smell, the precise, compact script marching down the columns. Her father's hand, ledgers copied in duplicate, marginal notes in his shorthand, dates, sums, initials, cross-references to transactions in both the MacDonald accounts and Rothmere's external legal disbursements. At the bottom of one page, consultation with Lady E.R.R.E. discrepancies, advised independent audit, L.M. present unexpectedly, Penrith evasive, L.M. Lady MacDonald. Susan's pulse thudded so hard the words blurred. She forced herself to breathe and read again, slower. The pattern emerged as cleanly as arithmetic. Controlled underpayments from her Scottish inheritance redirected through legal service charges, mirrored by irregular withdrawals from Rothmere estate reserves, all passing through Penrith's office under separate names. Years of siphoning, too small each quarter to ignite alarm, large enough in aggregate to corner a woman and tighten a widower's finances, until an expedient marriage looked sensible to everyone except those being sold. Not 2 schemes. One scheme with 2 households as its purse. "She gave these to your father?" Susan asked, voice unsteady. "Your father made the copies for her," Mrs. Pike said. "Said originals might vanish. He meant to return after Michaelmas and press the Earl directly. Then he took ill. Her ladyship hid what she had and waited for a chance. She wrote letters, some to Scotland, some never sent. After she died," the maid swallowed, "I kept the room locked. I kept waiting for someone to ask the right question." Susan looked down at the miniature again, at her own younger face painted by a stranger's patient brush. She thought of Rothmere reading forged letters, with a man's expressionless caution, of him saying, "I have trusted wrongly before, of his refusal to condemn and refusal to defend. Not contempt, not indifference. A survivor's terror of placing weight on rotten boards twice. The realization did not excuse his silence. It explained its shape. In the nursery, somewhere down the corridor, James cried out in his sleep, brief, frightened, alive. Susan rose, gathering the ledgers, the miniature, the devotional book. Her hands were steady now. "Mrs. Pike," she said, "can you swear to what you've told me?" The older woman straightened, dignity returning to her posture like a spine set true. "Before God, magistrate, and every gossip in this county." "Good." Susan met her gaze. "Then we are done with waiting." She took up the candle and moved toward the door, no longer feeling like a purchased stranger in someone else's haunted house, but like an heir to unfinished work. Survival had kept her upright. It would not by itself keep this house or that child safe. She would need evidence, witnesses, and timing. She would need the Earl to choose. And for the first time since signing her name over smeared wax, Susan MacDonald intended to make the terms. She would need evidence, witnesses, and timing. Susan carried the oilcloth bundle and miniature pressed under her arm all the way back to the nursery, the candle guttering with each quick step. James had settled again, though his sleep was thin and fretful. When he moaned, she sat beside him until his breathing lengthened. Only then did she allow herself to move. She did not return to her own chamber. Instead, she went to the small writing closet adjoining the schoolroom, where old copybooks and geography maps were kept, and slid the bundle beneath the false bottom of a drawer she had discovered 2 days earlier while hunting for spare slates. She kept the miniature in her reticule. If someone came looking for one cache, she would not lose all. By dawn she had sent 2 notes, one to Rothmere requesting a private interview before breakfast, one to the steward asking for the household wage books for the last 5 years and any surviving vouchers marked archival consultation. She sealed both with plain wax and handed them to a footman herself. He returned 15 minutes later, pale. "My lady, Mr. Penrith has arrived." So had the counterattack. Breakfast should have been routine. Silver warmers, kidneys, toast, the scrape of chairs. Instead, Penrith stood near the sideboard in travelling dust, a clerk at his shoulder, and Lady MacDonald seated as if presiding over a trial she had paid for. Rothmere was already at table, unreadable, coffee untouched. Penrith bowed. "Forgive the hour, my lord. Urgent fiduciary matters." Susan remained standing. "Your urgencies tend to coincide with my refusals." His smile suggested patient indulgence toward the female nerves. "Then perhaps clarity will soothe us all. Disturbing reports reached me late last evening that sealed private effects belonging to the late Countess Eleanor were opened without authorization." Lady MacDonald gave a soft, wounded sigh. "How dreadful if grief chambers are not respected." Susan looked directly at her. "You mean Mrs. Pike's room?" "I mean Lady Eleanor's," Lady MacDonald replied, eyes bright with satisfaction, "from which I am told papers are now missing." Rothmere's gaze snapped to Susan, then to Penrith. "Who told you this?" Penrith spread his hands. "Servants' talk. As your legal adviser, I must secure all documents relevant to probate, trusts, and succession. I therefore require immediate surrender of any removed correspondence." "Require," Susan said. He produced a folded notice. "Intended petition, my lady. If materials are withheld, allegations of misappropriation may become unavoidable." The clerk laid down a ledger-sized receipt book and uncapped his pen. Rothmere did not touch the notice. "You rode before dawn on gossip." "On risk," Penrith said. "Given the unfortunate letters currently in circulation, We cannot be too careful about forged materials entering legal record. There it was. He had moved the battlefield from rumour to law. If he branded Susan thief and forger before she produced proof, every real page she held could be dismissed as invention. Her father's name, her claim, Eleanor's warning, all could be buried under procedural propriety. Susan heard herself ask, "Where is Mrs. Pike?" A flicker passed between Penrith and Lady MacDonald, tiny but visible. Lady MacDonald dabbed her lips. Poor woman, overwrought. She has taken leave to visit family. At whose instruction? At mine, Rothmere said, and his voice was flint. Hargreaves informed me before breakfast that Pike was found in closed rooms after midnight sorting private papers. I ordered she be sent to her married niece in Millbrook until this is sorted. Susan stared at him. Without speaking to me! Without exposing the household to more talk, he said. Give me the papers, Susan. Her name, not title, not tenderness. Command edged with strain. Not in front of him, she said, nodding at Penrith. Penrith stiffened. My lord, delay endangers. Enough! Rothmere stood. You will wait in the library. Penrith hesitated one breath too long, then bowed and withdrew with his clerk. Lady MacDonald rose more slowly. I do hope, she murmured to Susan as she passed, that stubbornness has not made you careless. When they were alone, Rothmere faced Susan across the wreck of untouched breakfast. If you have removed documents, he said quietly, I need to see them now. She held his gaze. And if I show them, will you keep them from Penrith until we examine them independently? His jaw tightened. If they are genuine. If they prove fraud tied to him and Lady MacDonald, a beat. If they prove it, I will burn his career to the ground. She wanted to believe him. She did not yet know if belief was a luxury she could afford. Very well, she said. Come with me. The drawer was empty. No oilcloth, no ledger copies, no devotional volume. A clean hollow where her future had been. For one stunned second she thought she had chosen the wrong drawer. She checked again, then the neighbouring cabinet, then beneath the maps, then on her knees, absurdly, as though papers might have grown legs and skittered into corners. Behind her, Rothmere said nothing. At last she found one thing. A torn strip of oilcloth caught on a splintered edge, and a smear of soot across the inner panel. Someone had forced the false bottom, taken everything, and either searched by candle or deliberately marked the scene to suggest fire damage. Susan rose too quickly. Black dots flashed at the edge of her vision. I left them here less than 4 hours ago? Rothmere's expression had gone very still. Who knew? No one, except... She broke off. Mrs. Pike had seen the bundle. The footman had carried her notes. Hargreaves had keys to every room. Penrith had arrived before dawn. Rothmere picked up the torn oilcloth strip between finger and thumb. This proves only that something was stored. It proves someone came before us. Yes. Do you think I invented this? His silence lasted just long enough to hurt. I think, he said finally, that facts are vanishing faster than I can pin them down. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Mrs. Hargreaves appeared at the door, face arranged in alarm. My lord, forgive me. The young lord is distressed. He is asking for you and refuses his broth. James. Susan moved first. In the nursery she found the child rigid under blankets, eyes red-rimmed, lower lip shaking with anger he was too proud to name. A maid hovered uselessly with a tray. When James saw Susan, he flinched and turned his face into the pillow. I don't want her, he said thickly. Nanny says she went in Mamma's room and took things. The words hit harder than any county whisper. Susan stood very still, tray clattering softly as the maid set it down in relief and fled. Rothmere came in behind her, took in the scene, and crossed to the bed. "James, look at me!" The boy obeyed, trembling. "No one is to speak to you about adult disputes," Rothmere said, controlled but fierce. "Do you understand?" James nodded, then looked past him at Susan with betrayal raw on his small face. "Did you take Mamma's letters?" Susan answered before Rothmere could. "I took papers because I believed they might protect you." "From what?" She opened her mouth and closed it. "From your father's adviser. From my stepmother. From a web spun before you could write your name. None of that belonged in a child's sick room." "From people who lie," she said. He turned away again. Rothmere stood and faced Susan, exhaustion and anger braided together. "Until this is resolved, you will not question staff or remove records without me present." It was an order and a containment both. "You are confining me," she said. "I am containing a house on the edge of scandal." And handing Penrith the keys. His eyes closed briefly, as if against pain. "I am trying not to lose my son to panic." Something in her wanted to strike, to shout, to force him to choose now. Instead she bowed, because dignity sometimes looked like surrender until the moment it didn't. "As you wish, my lord." By evening the cost of that moment had multiplied. Mrs. Pike's niece in Millbrook sent word she had never arrived. The steward reported 2 West Wing servants missing from duty since dawn. Penrith remained in the library cataloguing relevant legal materials with his clerk, while Lady MacDonald received sympathetic callers in the drawing-room like a hostess at her own victory dinner. Susan sat alone in her dressing-room after dark, miniature clutched in one fist, and let doubt come for a full 5 minutes because fighting it only made it louder. She had no documents, no witness, no child's trust, and a husband who stood with one hand out and one hand back. For the first time since finding her father's script, uncertainty cracked the centre of her resolve. What if she had waited too long? What if endurance had taught her patience exactly when she needed speed? No answer came, only a knock. "Come!" Rothmere entered without coat or cravat. Shirt sleeves rolled as if formal armour had become unwearable. He closed the door behind him and stayed there, not crossing the room. "I cannot find Pike," he said. Susan did not rise. "Nor can I." He looked at the miniature in her hand. "What is that?" She held it out. He took it, frowned at the painted face, then looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" "In Eleanor's sitting room. Pike gave it to me. She told me Eleanor was my cousin. She told me Eleanor feared altered accounts and asked for me by name." Susan swallowed. "I had ledgers in my father's hand. They are gone." Rothmere stared at the miniature a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Lower, scraped raw. "Eleanor wrote to me in her last winter," he said. 3 letters from London while James was ill with croup. She said Penrith's figures did not reconcile. She said fees moved like smoke. I answered that she was overtired, that she should leave legal arithmetic to men paid for it. He gave a short, humourless breath. I can still recite my own words. I use them often enough. Susan said nothing. When she returned, he went on, eyes fixed not on her, but somewhere over her shoulder. She tried again. We argued in this house, in that corridor outside James's nursery while he slept. She asked for an external audit. I told her scandal would hurt the estate, and she was grieving her mother and seeing patterns where none existed. 2 months later, she was dead, and I had no proof, only missing sums too small to prosecute and too regular to ignore. He rubbed his thumb over the miniature's frame until the velvet darkened. Do you know what it is to suspect every kindness afterward? To watch people comfort your child and wonder which of them is counting silver in his head? This was not the Earl speaking from a mantelpiece. This was a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty. "I did not defend you," he said, "not because I believed those letters, because part of me believed anything was possible if I had been fool enough once." Susan's throat tightened. "And now my son flinches from the one person who kept him conscious in the mud, and the only woman who might confirm your account has vanished under my own order." His mouth twisted. "If this is a trap, it is a cruelly elegant one. If it is truth, I have repeated the same cowardice with a new wife." He crossed the room then, set the miniature on her dressing table with care, and met her eyes fully. "I do not know whom to trust," he said, "but I know this. Penrith will not leave this house with another scrap until I decide it. Tomorrow I will dismiss him, pending review. Lady MacDonald will force a public scene. She is already preparing one." He hesitated. "The winter assembly is in 3 nights. Invitations cannot be withdrawn without confirming every rumour she has seeded. She intends to speak." Susan felt the ground tilt toward decision. Public scene, then. Not avoided, used. "Then let her," she said. Rothmere searched her face as if trying to see whether resolve could be borrowed by proximity. "You have no papers?" "Not yet." "That is not a plan." "No," Susan said. "It is a refusal to die quietly." He shut his eyes, then gave one small nod that looked very much like surrender to something larger than pride. "Tell me what you need." Before she could answer, someone hammered at the corridor door hard enough to rattle hinges. A footman burst in, breathless. "My lord, beg pardon. Mr. Penrith requests you in the library at once. A magistrate's messenger has arrived from York." Rothmere swore under his breath and strode out. Susan followed, despite no invitation. In the library, Penrith stood beside the hearth, holding a sealed packet, with triumph barely veiled. Lady MacDonald sat in Eleanor's old chair, hands folded, expression pious. The messenger, a young man in riding boots, crusted white with the road salt, waited stiffly near the desk. "For the Earl of Rothmere," he said, extending the packet. "And for the Countess." Rothmere broke the seal, read, and went pale in a way Susan had not seen even beside his son's bed. He handed her the second sheet. It was notice of formal complaint, suspicion of fraudulent documents, unlawful removal of probate materials, and attempted coercion regarding estate transfers. The hearing was to be convened at Rothmere Abbey during the winter assembly, for convenience of principal parties and witnesses, under authority of a magistrate already travelling from York at Penrith's request. Lady MacDonald exhaled sadly. "How dreadful that matters have come so far!" Susan looked up from the page. "You mean exactly as far as you intended?" Penrith lifted his chin. "If your ladyship has exculpatory evidence, the hearing provides a proper venue." Proper venue. A room full of gentry primed for spectacle, a legal frame chosen by her accusers, and no guarantee her witness lived long enough to reach the door. Rothmere's voice was ice. "Get out of my library." Penrith bowed. "Of course, my lord. We shall reconvene in 3 evenings." When they were gone, silence rang. Rothmere turned to Susan. "We can still cancel." "And confirm guilt by retreat?" She folded the notice once, sharply. "No, if they want a stage, we will choose the script." She crossed to the steward's escritoire, pulled a fresh sheet, and began to write names. The parish clerk, who kept abstracts, the Edinburgh factor, who had received her father's duplicate notices, 2 former tenants pressed for sudden arrears, the stationer who sold her stepmother distinctive blue ribbon by the coil. Pieces, not victory. At the bottom she wrote one more line and sanded it dry. "Send this first," she told the steward, who had appeared silently in the doorway. "To Magistrate Hale directly, not through Penrith's office. Tell him I request his presence 1 hour before the assembly begins, privately in the library." The steward glanced at Rothmere. Rothmere held his gaze, then nodded once. "Do it," he said. The man left at a run. Only then did Susan let herself look at the empty grate, the dark windows, the 2 notices still on the desk like drawn blades. 3 nights, missing witness, stolen ledgers. A child who would not meet her eyes. Uncertain did not begin to cover it. But uncertainty, she thought, was merely terror before arithmetic. Known sums, unknown sums, and the discipline to keep counting anyway. Uncertain did not begin to cover it. But uncertainty, she thought, was merely terror before arithmetic. Known sums, unknown sums, and the discipline to keep counting anyway. 3 nights later, Rothmere Abbey blazed with candlelight. The winter assembly filled the long gallery and great hall with velvet, laughter too bright, and the rustle of people who had come ostensibly to dance and actually to witness ruin. Snow had begun at dusk, fine as sifted flour against the windows. Inside, strings tuned near the musicians' dais, while servants threaded through clusters of guests with trays of negus and wine. Susan stood at the edge of the ballroom in deep blue silk Lady MacDonald had once called too severe. Tonight she was grateful for the severity. At her wrist hung a small reticule containing 3 folded documents, a narrow ledger extract, and a packet of letters bound with plain twine. No blue ribbon. Across the room, Lady MacDonald held court beneath a gilt mirror, black satin and jet-catching candle fire with predatory elegance. Penrith hovered 2 paces behind her shoulder, speaking in low murmurs to Sir Lionel Vane, one of the county magistrate's deputies. Every now and then, Penrith glanced towards Susan with the confidence of a man who believed procedures belonged to him. Rothmere came to stand beside her, not touching, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers when he breathed. "Hale arrived an hour ago," he said quietly. "He is in the library with the steward as requested." "Did anyone see him?" "Only those I intended." His gaze moved over the room. "Are you certain?" "No," Susan said, "but I am ready." His mouth tightened, then softened by a degree she had learned to read as trust. "Then begin before she does." At the far end of the hall, Lady MacDonald lifted her fan and gave a little tap against a glass to gather attention. Conversation thinned. Heads turned. Penrith straightened. Susan stepped forward first. "My lords, ladies!" Her voice carried farther than she expected. The room paused, surprised into silence. She met Lady MacDonald's eyes and went on. "Before any public statement is made regarding my conduct, I request that the Earl's steward summon Magistrate Hale from the library." A ripple went through the crowd. Confusion, interest, hunger. Lady MacDonald laughed lightly. "My poor Susan, this is not a courtroom." "No," Susan said, "it is a room full of witnesses, which is why I ask now." Penrith's smile snapped thin. "Magistrate Hale is not scheduled to—" "Mr. Penrith," Rothmere said, voice like iron drawn on stone, "you will not instruct my staff in my house." He lifted one hand. The steward, waiting near the doorway, bowed and departed at once. Lady MacDonald's fan stilled. "This is absurd theatrics. Must we indulge hysteria because a girl cannot bear scrutiny?" Susan took another step into the centre of the polished floor. Candlelight caught her face and left no place to hide. "If scrutiny is what you want, madam, I welcome it." The library doors opened within moments. Magistrate Hale entered with snow still melting on his boots and his clerk carrying a dispatch box. Hale was a broad, practical man in his 50s, with tired eyes and the expression of one not easily entertained by aristocratic dramatics. "Your lordship," he said to Rothmere, then looked to Susan. "My lady, you requested immediate hearing of disputed allegations." "I did," Susan turned so all could hear. I'm accused of forging correspondence, stealing probate papers, and coercing estate transfers. I ask that these charges be examined now in order, with documents and witnesses present. Penrith barked a short laugh. At a dance? Hale regarded him coolly. At a property where the relevant records are held, with principal parties assembled, yes. Unless you wish to withdraw your own complaint, Mr. Penrith. A murmur quickly smothered. Penrith bowed stiffly. Certainly not. Then to the library, Hale said. No one wished to be excluded. The crowd flowed after them in a rustling tide. County wives, neighbouring baronets, curious cousins, 2 clergymen, and one determined baker's widow who had somehow gained entry with Lady Winters. Servants lined walls and pretended invisibility while listening with perfect concentration. In the library, Hale took the Earl's chair behind the desk and set his clerk at a side table. Proceed. Penrith began at once, smooth and indignant. He produced a written complaint describing Susan's obsessive fixation on replacing the late Countess, her unauthorised entry into sealed rooms, and her likely fabrication of financial irregularities to seize independent control of assets. He submitted the forged letters with a flourish. Hale read, expression neutral. Lady Rothmere. Susan took the top forged letter from the stack, then drew from her reticule a sheet of her genuine hand, a page from the Abbey dairy accounts, signed and witnessed 6 months earlier. These are said to be mine, she said, holding both toward Hale. Compare the long S, the pressure marks on downstrokes, and the spacing before numerals. In my hand, figures sit close to preceding words because I learned bookkeeping on narrow columns. In these, spacing is ornamental. Also, I do not dot I with circles. A few guests leaned in involuntarily. Hale did too. Penrith cut in. Graphology parlour tricks prove nothing. Any skilled hand might alter style. Indeed, Susan said. So let us discuss materials. She set down the forged letters and untied her twine bundle. Inside were 6 notes in Lady Macdonald's hand, invitations and household instructions from Edinburgh years earlier. Beside them she placed one of the forged pages. The forged packet was tied with a blue ribbon from Bell and Fry stationers on Princes Street. Distinctive weave, imported stock. Lady Macdonald purchases it by the coil. Susan nodded to the steward. Mr. Bell is present. From the doorway, a thin man with ink-stained cuffs stepped forward, hat crushed in nervous hands. My ladyship. Her ladyship, Lady Macdonald, has an account. Blue French ribbon, 3-yard bolts, regular order. Lady Macdonald's face did not move. Blue ribbon exists in half of England. Quite, Susan said, which is why this alone is insufficient. Next item? She took up a parish abstract book borrowed from St. Jude's clerk that morning. In letter 2, the writer claims to have observed Lady Eleanor at Harrowby in June, and copied her manner there. Parish records place Lady Eleanor in confinement at Rothmere that month, attended by Dr. Ellison and baptised witness to James's cousin on June 12th. She could not be in 2 places. Penrith said sharply, dates may be misremembered. Susan turned a page. Then let us use money, which remembers better. From her reticule she withdrew a narrow extract written in her father's hand. Only 1 page, creased and smoke-marked, the sole scrap recovered from beneath a loose flag in the schoolroom hearth, where she had looked after discovering the theft. Not enough to prove the whole scheme alone. Enough to open the door. My father copied this from dual account books before his death. It lists quarterly archival consultation payments, from Rothmere matched to legal charges against my Scottish lands. Same days, same sums, separate clients, same destination account. Penrith's composure cracked. Fabricated, conveniently undated. Dated in shorthand at the margin, Susan replied. I have the key because I learned it at his desk. Also, Mr. Rourke of Edinburgh holds duplicate notices he received under my father's seal. He arrived this afternoon. She looked toward the back. A heavy-set Scotsman in travel-stained coat stepped forward with a packet wrapped in waxed cloth. Delivered by express when her ladyship's note reached me, he said gruffly. Duplicates are MacDonald reckonings, lodged with me for safe keeping after Mr. MacDonald took ill. He handed them to Hale, who broke seals and scanned quickly. His brows rose. Penrith lunged verbally before the magistrate could speak. These so-called duplicates lack chain custody. Any clerk could forge... Chain custody? Susan's voice sharpened for the first time. Shall we discuss custody, then? The papers I discovered were stolen from a locked drawer between dawn and breakfast, the morning you arrived unannounced. 2 West Wing servants vanished the same hour. Mrs. Pike, principal witness, disappeared en route to Millbrook under an order you encouraged my husband to issue. I did no such thing, Rothmere spoke, each word clipped. You urged immediate removal, Penrith turned red, for propriety. For silence, Susan said. Lady MacDonald snapped her fan closed like a pistol cocking. Enough. This is slander stitched from hurt pride. You have always envied women born to influence, Susan. You mimic, you pry, and now you accuse your own mother because you cannot bear that your husband doubts you. The room held its breath on the word mother. Susan faced her fully. You are my father's widow, not my mother. And this is not envy. It is arithmetic. She stepped to Hale's desk and laid out a final sequence. Rothmere disbursement vouchers marked archival consultation, corresponding debits from MacDonald Estate under contested legal clarification, Penrith's signatures on both, and parish abstracts showing altered beneficiary dates in Lady MacDonald's submitted copies versus church originals. Page 32, Susan said. Sum £48, 2 shillings. Page 41, same sum routed as arrears against me. Witness signature copied from a dead tenant. Next quarter £53, 7 shillings. Next 60. Pattern repeats for 6 years. If this is error, it is the most disciplined error in Britain. Silence. Then, from the corridor, a voice rasped, and he told me to burn the rest. Every head turned. Mrs. Pike stood in the doorway, shawl snow-dusted, one cheek bruised, yellowing at the edge. Behind her, gripping her elbow protectively, was the Abbey groom Tom, with a split lip. Pike lifted her chin. Beg pardon for lateness. Coach wheel went in a ditch outside Millbrook. She came forward, reached into her basket, and produced 2 soot-smudged ledger books. Found these under coal sacks in the old brewhouse after Tom heard kitchen lads bragging of extra coin for a dawn errand. Penrith went white. Hale stood. Mr. Penrith, you will remain where you are. Penrith moved anyway, one backward step toward the side door. Rothmere blocked him, not dramatic, simply immovable. Sit, the Earl said. Penrith sat. The fight did not end there. Hale ordered the library cleared of all but principal parties, key witnesses, and 4 county gentlemen for legal observation. Guests protested, then complied in offended swirls of silk. The doors shut. Candles hissed softly in the sudden claustrophobic quiet. For 2 hours the room became a battlefield of ink. Penrith recovered enough nerve to attack every point. He challenged Pike's reliability, servant sentiment, hysteria. He questioned Rourke's packet seals. He claimed dual representations were lawful and merely misunderstood fee-sharing. He suggested Rothmere himself had authorised transfers verbally. He implied Susan manipulated records to seize autonomy from husband and guardians alike. Lady MacDonald adapted with chilling speed. She no longer played wounded matron. She played outraged co-victim. "Mr. Penrith handled my affairs for years with complete trust," she said, palms uplifted. "If improprieties occurred, perhaps I was deceived as much as anyone." When Hale pressed on altered dates in her own petitions, she feigned confusion. "I signed where instructed. I'm no accountant." Susan did not let up. She asked permission to examine each ledger aloud. Hale granted it. She moved line by line, naming sums, spotting duplicated pen nib scratches where entries had been copied over erased originals, matching receipt numbers to parish death registers that proved supposed signatories were dead before payment dates. When Penrith objected, she produced corroborating books from Rothmere's grain office and tenant rent rolls she had requested days earlier. At one point, Penrith slammed a palm on the desk. "This is harassment by numeracy. Minor discrepancies in vast estates are inevitable." "In one estate, perhaps," Susan said. "In two, synchronised to the quarter day, always through your office, never once in your own disfavour. That is not inevitability. That is design." Lady MacDonald struck where she thought Susan weakest: character. "She always wanted control," she told the observing gentleman. As a girl, she sat with her father over vulgar ledgers and scorned proper accomplishments. Is it surprising she now seeks dominion over a title she never earned by breeding? Susan turned, very calm. "Breeding did not teach you to forge parish dates." A muscle jumped in Lady MacDonald's jaw. Hale asked for direct answer regarding one specific altered abstract. Beneficiary date changed to render Susan legally dependent at the moment debt instruments were executed. Lady MacDonald hesitated, then said, "My solicitor prepared that copy." "Did you read it before signing?" "Not in detail." "Yet your initials appear beside the altered line." "I initialed many lines." "Conveniently," Susan said, "all those that transferred money toward your private accounts." Lady MacDonald's composure finally frayed. "You ungrateful little drudge. Everything I did was to preserve standing after your father's disastrous speculations." "My father's books are here," Susan answered. "He speculated less than you spent on lace." Tom the groom, called in and sworn, testified he had seen Penrith's clerk pay 2 servants to remove old waste before dawn the day of the theft. One missing servant was found by midnight drunk in a roadside alehouse with sovereigns he could not explain. Under questioning, he admitted carrying a package from schoolroom to brewhouse and being told by Penrith's man that it contained mouldy devotional rubbish. The servant wept. Penrith sweated through his collar. Lady MacDonald sat rigid as carved jet. When Hale finally leaned back, rubbing his brow, the table before him was layered with documents in Susan's ordered stacks and Penrith's disordered objections. "Findings preliminary but sufficient," Hale said. "I have probable cause for charges of fraud, falsification of records, witness intimidation, and attempted destruction of evidence against Mr. Penrith. Temporary seizure of his practice books is ordered at once." Penrith made a strangled sound. "You cannot! My clients—" "I can!" Hale turned to Lady MacDonald. "As to your ladyship, signatures and altered submissions tie you materially to fraudulent transfers. Further prosecution is available. Immediate injunction. You are barred from executing or influencing any claim against the MacDonald estate pending full hearing. Restitution calculations to be prepared." Lady MacDonald rose so abruptly her chair tipped. "This is a conspiracy orchestrated by a resentful stepdaughter and a husband bewitched by resemblance." No one moved to right her chair. Her eyes found Susan and burned. "You think this victory makes you mistress. You are still the purchased plaything you always were." Susan felt the words strike old scars and fail to open them. "I was purchased," she said evenly. "I'm no longer for sale." She looked to Hale. Magistrate, I request formal criminal prosecution remain available to the Crown. Personally, I petition first for complete restitution, public acknowledgement of fraud, and permanent removal of Lady MacDonald's authority over my father's estate. Rothmere looked at her, startled, perhaps expecting blood for blood. Hale inclined his head. A measured petition. Noted. Lady MacDonald laughed once, brittle and disbelieving. Mercy from you? Not mercy, Susan said. Boundaries. For the first time, something like fear crossed Lady MacDonald's face. When the doors reopened, the remaining guests surged for news and then recoiled at what they saw. Penrith, under guard of 2 constables, Hale had quietly posted outside. Lady MacDonald, walking unsteadily, chin high and eyes glittering with defeated rage. Rothmere beside Susan, not shielding her, not ahead of her, simply at her shoulder as if that were where he had always meant to stand. No music resumed. People bowed and curtsied with awkward haste, suddenly uncertain how to address the woman they had spent months dissecting. Susan scarcely heard them. Her body had discovered shaking now that speech was no longer required. In the withdrawing room she braced one hand on a marble table and stared at the veining until it steadied. Rothmere dismissed everyone with a look. Mrs. Hargreaves lingered, then retreated, closing the door softly. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Susan laughed. One short, astonished burst that tipped into a breathless near-sob. I cannot feel my hands. Rothmere poured water, brought it to her, and this time did not stop short of contact. His fingers closed around hers and the glass together, anchoring both. His own hand trembled. You were magnificent, he said, voice rough and raw. And I am ashamed it took catastrophe for me to say that aloud. She drank, then set the glass down with care. Did we win? He almost smiled, exhausted. Hale has seized Penrith's records and frozen her claims. In legal terms, yes. In social terms, he glanced toward the muffled hum of departing guests. By breakfast, all Yorkshire will know exactly whom to fear at a ledger table. That drew a real smile from her, brief and fierce. The door cracked open and James slipped in, nightshirt under an hastily buttoned jacket, hair tousled. He should have been in bed. He had clearly escaped supervision. He halted when he saw them and looked suddenly uncertain. I heard shouting, he said to his father, then to Susan, not meeting her eyes. Nanny said there were magistrates. Mrs. Pike appeared behind him, breathless. Beg pardon, he ran. It's all right, Susan said. James studied the carpet. Did you lie? No, she said. He nodded once, as if filing a corrected sum. After a hesitation that seemed enormous in a 7-year-old body, he crossed the room and leaned, awkwardly, quickly, against her side. Not quite an embrace, a declaration nonetheless. Susan closed her eyes for one heartbeat and rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. From the doorway, Mrs. Pike watched with tears standing bright and unashamed. Past midnight, with the house finally quiet and snow muting the world beyond the glass, Rothmere asked Susan to come to the blue drawing-room, the same room where she had first been called by another woman's name. The fire had burned low. No servants waited. He shut the door himself and stood with his back to it, as if preventing interruption not from others but from old habits. I have spent years mistaking control for safety, he said, without preamble. Tonight I watched you take a room that wanted your humiliation and turn it into a court of fact. I watched you choose justice over vengeance when vengeance was deserved, and I understood belatedly that I have been asking you to live in a house where trust was rationed like winter coal. Susan sat, suddenly tired to the bone. I did not come here expecting trust. I came expecting survival. And now, She looked into the fire. Now I want more than that, which is inconvenient. A broken laugh escaped him. Inconvenient may be the kindest word for what I feel. He came closer, then stopped, giving her space to refuse. Eleanor was my friend before she was my wife. Her death tore something loose in me, yes, but the greater wound was realizing I had doubted her when she needed me to stand beside her. When you arrived and Pike spoke that name, he swallowed, I thought fate was mocking me. Then the letters appeared, and I thought I was being tested for stupidity a second time. So I did what cowards do elegantly. I withheld judgment and called it prudence. Susan met his eyes. It hurt. I know. He exhaled shakily. I do not ask you to forget that. I ask whether there is any road from here that is not merely polite coexistence. She considered him, this difficult man who had failed her, and then at last stood beside her when it mattered most. There might be, but not if you only ever speak in half measures. Then no half measures. He knelt before her chair, a movement so unguarded it stole her breath. I love my son with a fear that borders on madness. I loved my first wife and failed her in one fatal way. I did not expect to love again because I believed love would demand trust I no longer possessed. You have made that belief untenable. His hands were open on his knees, empty of performance. I love your mind. I love the way you become still when others posture, because that is when you are most dangerous and most honest. I love that James listens when you speak because you never lie to him, even to soothe. I love that you can wound with precision and choose not to. I love you, Susan MacDonald, not as a settlement, not as a remedy for grief, not as a ghost in a familiar shape, as yourself. She had not known until that moment how fiercely she had wanted those exact distinctions. Tears came. She did not hide them. You are very late, my lord. I am aware, he said, with a faint, wrecked smile. If lateness disqualifies me, I will accept sentence. She leaned forward and touched his face, thumb brushing the line of strain at his mouth. You are exasperating and proud, and sometimes so controlled I want to shake you. A wet laugh escaped her. But when I asked for a magistrate tonight, you did not silence me. When Penrith moved, you blocked the door. That mattered. It was the least. It was the beginning, she corrected gently. He bowed his head over her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the same hand once forced down over smeared wax, and looked up. May I begin properly, then? Susan, will you choose this marriage with me, now that no choice is possible? She held his gaze. Yes. The word seemed to undo something in him. He rose slowly, giving her time to step back. She did not. When he kissed her, it was careful at first, almost reverent, then deeper, with years of restraint giving way, not to hunger alone, but relief. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. There is one more thing, he said softly. Tomorrow, at church, I intend to introduce you before all who require correction. As what? My wife, he said. Susan MacDonald, Countess of Rortmere. No ghosts, she smiled, tired and luminous. Then I will wear blue again. Sunday morning broke cold and brilliant. Frost silvered the churchyard stones. Villagers and county families packed St. Jude's pews with that peculiar piety sharpened by fresh scandal. After the final hymn, Rortmere remained standing when others reached for cloaks. He took Susan's hand, not brief assistance but an unmistakable clasp, and turned to face the congregation. Before we depart, he said, voice carrying to the back wall, I wish to correct a falsehood too long indulged in my household and beyond it. This is my wife, Susan MacDonald, Countess of Rortmere. She has defended this family and estate with integrity under trial. Any slight offered to her will be considered slight to me. Silence, then a rustle of bows and curtsies, some sincere, some strategic, all visible. From the side aisle, Mrs. Pike came forward with James at her side. The older woman dropped into a deep curtsy, tears bright on her lined cheeks. "Good morning, Lady Rothmere," she said clearly. Susan bent and lifted her before she could sink fully. "Good morning, Mrs. Pike." James tugged Susan's glove. "Will you come see my map after dinner? I fixed the river you said was wrong." "With pleasure," she said gravely. "Errors must be corrected." Outside, Lady Winters intercepted them, cheeks pink in the cold. "My dear, I owe you an apology and a call, in that order." "Start with tea," Susan replied. "Apologies are improved by cake." Lady Winters laughed, startled into liking her. 2 days later, in the Abbey's old estate office, sunlight lay in pale bars across the desk where ledgers now sat in ordered stacks. Rothmere accounts on the left, MacDonald restitution files on the right. Hale's clerk had spent the morning taking sworn inventories. Penrith's practice was under seizure pending full trial in York. Lady MacDonald, pending civil determinations and under injunction, had accepted residence in Bath under supervised allowance rather than immediate public indictment. Her signature on the agreement was hard enough to tear paper. She signed in Susan's presence. "You think you've ended me," Lady MacDonald said, pen trembling with fury. "I think I've ended your access," Susan answered. At the door, Lady MacDonald paused. For an instant her face showed its true age and exhaustion beneath powder and hauteur. "He will tire of your righteousness." "Perhaps," Susan said, "but he will not confuse it with deceit again." Lady MacDonald left without farewell. Out. That afternoon Rothmere came in carrying 2 cups of coffee and found Susan bent over a restitution schedule with the steward. "Page 12, she was saying. "These tenant overcharges go back to families, not to central reserves. We do not heal theft by repeating hierarchy." The steward blinked, then nodded slowly. "Yes, my lady." Rothmere set down her cup by her right hand, exactly where she preferred it, and waited until she glanced up. "Magistrate's courier," he said, offering a sealed packet. Inside was confirmation, temporary transfer of the MacDonald Scottish acreage back to Susan's independent control pending final court ratification. Her father's seal reference was listed correctly for the first time in years. She let out a breath that sounded like a door unlatching. "Will you go north to inspect in spring?" Rothmere asked. "Yes," she said, then smiled at him over the paper. "Will you come?" "With boots suitable for mud," he said solemnly. She laughed. That evening, as dusk turned the windows to mirrors, Susan sat at the same desk where she had once hidden stolen truth and now prepared transparent accounts. James occupied the carpet with his map, frowning in concentration. Mrs. Pike mended by the fire, humming under her breath. Rothmere, across from Susan, reviewed tenant petitions and passed one to her with a pencilled note. "Your judgment," she wrote beneath it. "Remit half. Require roof repairs before Michaelmas. Visit in person." He read, nodded and signed. No fanfare, no witnesses. Just partnership, line by line. At last only one document remained. The formal letter to Edinburgh finalising restoration of her father's estate and renouncing Lady MacDonald's authority permanently. Susan heated sealing wax, held it above the fold, and let the red bead gather. Her hand did not shake. Wax fell in a clean, unbroken circle. She pressed her signet. MacDonald and Rothmere, quartered together by legal amendment, completed that morning, and lifted it to reveal a sharp, steady impression. Across the desk, Rothmere watched, then reached to warm her fingers between his. Outside, snow began again, soft against the old stone. Inside, the fire burned bright. The child muttered over rivers and roads. and Susan MacDonald, no ghost, no purchase, no placeholder, set the finished seal to dry.